Hello and welcome to the Dr. Suzette Glasner Podcast. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want to continue to learn from me. According to a recent study, including over 10,000 adolescents, the use of nicotine pouches is on the rise and has nearly doubled in the last couple of years. So on today's episode, I want to talk about what nicotine pouches are, what the health risks are, and why we should be concerned about the increase in the use of these products among our young people. So nicotine pouches are a small, rectangular-shaped pouch that contains nicotine, not tobacco, but nicotine as well as additives in a powder form. They are placed in between the gum and the lip. They're very small. You can't see them. You don't have to spit like you do with chewing tobacco. There's no smoke. Obviously, that's why it's a smokeless method of using nicotine. And it's hands-free because it just sits in your mouth. This does make them a convenient option for nicotine consumption, and they're really intended only for adult use, since we do know that nicotine is obviously an addictive and a highly addictive chemical. Recently, the FDA has approved these pouches for marketing to adults 21 or over. And what's interesting is that in 2024, a research study showed that less than 1% of adults were using them. So that raised questions about who is buying these pouches then, and come to find that they're much more widely used, according to our research sources, by young people than they are by adults for whom they are actually intended. Just to give you an idea of the rates of utilization, when we survey over 10,000 adolescents or teens from around the country, what we find is that the use of these pouches has nearly doubled. So in 2024, almost 5.5% of teens said that they had used or were using nicotine pouches, and that's compared to about 3% just the year before in 2023. We also learned that more teens reported using these nicotine pouches in the past 30 days and the past 12 months, as well as using both pouches and e-cigarettes compared to 2023. Just to be a little bit more specific, 3.6% of teens had used both products in the past 12 months when they were surveyed, and that's compared to just slightly over 2% in 2023. So you can project just how rapidly the use of these pouches is expanding and how much more we might expect it to expand over the coming couple of years unless we put some new regulations and practices into place to educate young people around the risks associated with this. And one of the things that's not really helping to slow this down is this concept of Zinfluencers. So Zyn is one of the brands that produces these nicotine pouches, and they're really surging in terms of their popularity on social media. So if you do a quick Google search on Zinfluencers, you'll find the following phrase, which I found interesting. A Zinfluencer is an ambassador for Zyn nicotine pouches, promoting their favorite flavor and sharing their experiences with others. As a Zinfluencer, you have the opportunity to influence the nicotine community by showcasing the benefits and unique aspects of Zyn pouches. So you can imagine people are going online and talking about their use of Zyn products, and these nicotine pouches in particular. We're like spreading the buzz around nicotine, and just some recent data showed that TikToks that use the word Zyn in them have received over 715 million views. The National Institutes of Health launched a research study just a couple of years ago in 2022 to look at what people are saying in social media about nicotine. So they looked at the top themes attached to the word nicotine addiction. Mostly, they were talking about physical or psychological effects of nicotine. So many of them were talking about withdrawal on TikTok, and also physical or psychological benefits, tasting good, feeling buzzed, and then the social benefits like bonding with other people who use nicotine. But what's interesting about those who were less than 21 years of age is that those who were younger were not really posting much about quitting, whereas you saw content about quitting more commonly posted by individuals who are over 21. And that's not surprising because sometimes you have to have a longer term experience with a substance before you decide that it is not only doing some things that you like, but it's also doing some things that you really don't like. But you can see thematically people who are posting about Zyn products, nicotine pouches are more skewed towards talking about the positive effects of them. So people have been saying saying that part of the reason that they opt to use something like a nicotine pouch is that it might provide a less harmful alternative to tobacco-based products, and it also might help them to quit other tobacco-based products. What we know about whether or not something like a nicotine pouch could help somebody to quit using tobacco-based products is very little. There really haven't been a ton of research studies around whether that is a fact or a myth, but we do know that we have FDA-approved ways of reducing one's intake of nicotine, such as the nicotine patch, there's gum, there's lozenges, and you have a very predictable quantity of nicotine that's going into your system when you use these products, and then you can very systematically and intentionally taper them down until you stop using nicotine. So given that we have these FDA-approved methods, those would be likely the safest ways of discontinuing one's use of nicotine if you're trying to quit. Whereas with the nicotine pouches, we don't have much research around the long-term health effects of nicotine pouches. We know that other forms of smokeless tobacco raise the risk of various types of cancer, mouth and throat cancer in particular, but we don't know much about the long-term effects of nicotine pouches specifically. But we do know that in the shorter term, people do say that they lead to some discomfort in their mouth, so they can develop mouth sores and things like that are uncomfortable. Probably the most concerning aspect of the nicotine pouches is that nicotine, with or without tobacco, is highly addictive. Like other harder drugs like cocaine and heroin, nicotine causes increased amounts of the chemical dopamine to be released into the brain, and dopamine regulates feelings of pleasure. So obviously that feels really good and makes us want to repeat that behavior. Also, the buzz from nicotine, which peaks in about the first 30 minutes, the natural human tendency is to want to repeat that or re-experience that feeling. So that will lead to repetitive use of these pouches. And because they're so convenient, they're so easy, they're concealable, you don't have to spit. For a young person, especially one who is being very secretive about their substance use, it makes it just so easy to repeat that behavior over and over again in a way that is likely to produce addictive behaviors. And then you find yourself transitioning from enjoying the pleasure or the buzz from the use of the nicotine pouch to then starting to try to avoid the withdrawal symptoms that can emerge once you've used these pouches or any other form of nicotine repeatedly over time. And then your brain is shifting all the while, which is very risky for young people for whom their brains are still developing. They're still developing good judgment, good reasoning, impulse control, all of these functions that can be disrupted by the chronic use of mind-altering substances. Other research has suggested that exposure to nicotine during adolescence can cause problems with learning, memory, and attention. And those functions are very important for young people to be successful in the endeavors that are the most essential to them, like school. And when school performance suffers, that also places young people at risk for other psychological problems and difficulties, even including the later formation of addictive behavior patterns. The other concern around the way in which teens and young people are latching onto these products is via the way that they're packaged and marketed. So they're marketed in these really yummy flavors. They're available in citrus flavors and cinnamon flavors and other very attractive flavors, so that initiation among youth becomes even more likely because of that appeal. Is the use of nicotine pouches like a gateway to the use of other substances? We don't have studies specific to nicotine pouches on this, but we do have studies around other forms of nicotine use, particularly vaping. So according to a series of recent studies, teens who vape are at greater risk of switching over to regular cigarettes. For example, high schoolers who use e-cigarettes are 7 times more likely to smoke regular cigarettes 6 months later when you compare them to those who don't vape. So again, pouches aren't the same as vaping, but if we can draw on that research literature, it does suggest that young people who start to use nicotine early are elevating their risk of going on to experiment with other substances. And not only are adolescents and young adults at greater risk of developing nicotine addiction, but early exposure to nicotine also elevates their risk of developing a mood disorder and of lowering their impulse control. And lowering impulse control can create a whole host of other behavioral and psychological problems, as you can imagine. So the other thing to be mindful of is that once a person is exposed to nicotine, they may tend to experience other substances as more pleasurable. They primed their dopamine system to respond to substances that can be misused or that can be habit forming. And so that's partly why young people who are exposed to nicotine at a younger age may be more vulnerable to addiction to other stimulants like cocaine or even methamphetamine. So bottom line, if you're thinking about nicotine pouches as a way to reduce your use of other nicotine or tobacco-based products, I would recommend that you turn to what we know to be FDA approved and relatively safe and tolerable, and what we understand the longer-term effects of, like nicotine pouches, lozenges, and gum, and these other very well-established ways of achieving that. And if you're looking at nicotine pouches, or your young person is thinking about nicotine pouches as a safer alternative to other forms of tobacco use, then really talking to them about more broadly the implications of using nicotine in any form for one's longer-term health and well-being and one's psychological health and well-being, including the risk of developing addiction, is something that should be paid very close attention to, and not to be so deceived by the ease of use, the convenience, and the general appeal of the flavors of nicotine pouches. And then also just for parents and educators, just to have greater awareness of the fact that this is a rapidly expanding behavior around the use of nicotine pouches, which again may be a little bit harder to detect than more traditional forms of nicotine use like smoking. You can tell when somebody smells like smoke, and it can't be concealed as they're going about their day-to-day. So I hope you found this information helpful and useful, and I look forward to seeing you again the next time.